let's see here. Where are the questions you asked me? I thought I'd just record on a video of the original 8 and Super 8 film that we took of R108 back in the 60s. This is winter of 1965 and 6. We'd just gotten the car back from the paint shop, and we're getting ready to run the 1966 season. This, we think, is the very first race that R103 ever ran. You see there's no red on the roof or whatever. It's at Osceola, Florida, which is, and it was an emergency Navy field. I tried to find it when I was in Florida in '87, but there are houses all over the place. It's kind of northeast of Orlando and east of Sanford and southwest of Daytona. And that's Webster Benner, the first fellow, the magician, who lived in Lakeland. And I'm looking here at your questions. You asked me in number one, just exactly how did you come to drive R103 during the '66 SCCA season? Well, actually, I first saw that previous shot there that was from, this is my Formula V, by the way, that was taken at Osceola. That's the first time I saw R103, and there was another fellow driving it, and he was having some difficulty, to say the least, so they asked me to drive the car. And I was about 5 seconds a lap faster and got out of it, and like a good Ford engineer said, well, you have to do this to the front shocks and do that to the rear and so forth and so on. And one thing led to another, and of course that was kind of mid-year in 1965, and as a result then we put together a team with Webster and myself and a couple other fellows, including my son. That dirty old helmet pretty soon gave away to a clean one, I'll tell you that, to a new helmet when it was obvious that we were going to do real well. I think this was at Fernandina Beach, you know, up north, almost up in the corner of the state on in that Porsche over there on the other side. That's Peter Gregg, the late Peter Gregg. And so that's how I came to drive it. And then at the end of the '65 season, after I'd finished fourth at the runoffs for the national championship at Daytona, well, I was running second till Bob Johnson tapped me in the rear and spun me, and by the time I recovered from that, I was in fourth place. So after that, the owner of the car, Randy Blessing, said, well, Walt, if you want to drive it next year, fine, but you'll have to get your own sponsorship and so forth and so on, which we did. And so Webster and I ran the car in 1966. And you ask here, number two, how does the level of competition during that season compare to what you've seen in SCCA racing lately? Well, it's all relative. Really, racing is relative, you know. If you make everybody run on street tires, it'll probably still be proportionally to each other as fast as they were. And now we're running here at Savannah. And I think most of this is in 1966 now. So the competition was as tough then as it is now. Of course, now the cars are extremely changed, and much more higher tech, and much faster and so forth. But again, it was all relative. Actually, I took my coupe through a SCCA driver school last year with one of my customers that went through also in his Shelby, and that was the Twin. And this is lunchtime here on the video, changing rear axle ratio. It's still at Savannah during the probably on the Saturday practice area session. So yes, ma'am. Yep. Anyway, where were we here? Well, I lost my train of thought, but that's not abnormal for a guy like me. So we proceed on here, and we went through driver about last summer. Look fast, stiff, and quiet, and the people really got a thrill seeing the old Mustangs run. And the next question is, in your opinion, how did R103 stack up as a racing car? Where were its weaknesses and its strong points, and how did you feel it compared with the competition? Well, there are two ways to look at it. At $59.95, it was one heck of a race car. You know, for an out-of-the-box race car. But when we actually started driving and using the car, we found out it really left a lot to be desired, and so we ended up after several races taking the car back and stripping it down and re-welding most everything we could, and then starting our own development on the car. Right there in the picture is where it broke a main bearing cap. That's how that Lotus Elan got ahead of me, and that was at Savannah. And so that night we scrounged around. That's the first time I ever knew there was a 221 engine. And we got a main bearing cap off a 221 engine, and Webster shimmed it up with brass shim stock, and here we are back on the track the next day. Same engine, different, but with one different main bearing cab. That's Peter Gregg again there in his 906. And anyway, as a race car. But when we finally got the thing working, it was terrific. You know, we beat every Cobra, big and small block, that we ran against until we got to Riverside. And in '66, all the vets, a couple Ferraris that were still around, and XKE Jag, and all the Tigers except Ron Dykes. When we got to Riverside, which you'll see here later, that was a Tiger that was built by Hollywood Sports in '65, and it was one going Tiger. It was the only going Tiger that there was. Corvettes were no problem. But the Lotus Elan was tough on really tight tracks because it was the car weighed less than, I think, or about half what our car did, and it ran a 1600cc twin cam Ford engine. But because of the reduced weight, of course, the thing would stop very quickly. This was an airport course that we ran in Decatur, Alabama, and Bob Tullius was there. I think that might have been the first time Bob and I ran against each other, and he was running a Dodge Dart, and you see that large installation there with the Ford Econoline in the tent. That's us. And then on over to the left of us is Bob Tullius's rig. And and he had a Dodge Dart with him, and I think a Triumph, and so. But the Dodge, Bob drove in the same race as I did with the Dart, even though he was running in A sedan, I was running in B production. And as I remember here, I think we beat him there, and then I had the opportunity to run against him in February '67 at the Trans Am preceding the 24-hour. And I ran second to Bob in the former year's Trans Am winner, the Yeager Johnson coupe, A sedan Mustang coupe, which unfortunately put a rod through the pan at a 72nd out of 75 laps. And this is Bob's Dart, and this is still at in Decatur. And that's their Triumph. Is that TR4? I don't know. If it's not American Iron, I don't know it very well. Well, anyway, you ask here the weakness and the strong points of the Shelby. Well, I think in one respect, the 108-inch wheelbase really worked to our advantage. It made it an easy car to drive compared to some of the other cars that I had driven. Because things seem to happen slower with the long wheelbase of the Shelby. also to its advantage. It started out at 2,550 pounds, and when we finished with it before going to Riverside, we were almost down to, I think it was 2,406 without a spare tire, and no gas was the lightest that we ever weighed, which was below the minimum. So we had to make sure that we added gas in the amount that when we finished the race, the car was at the minimum, which was, well, right around that figure, the minimum that was allowed on it. Shortcomings, well, I would say as compared to a vehicle designed as a racing car like that 904 and some of the European cars, it was a high-maintenance vehicle. If you wanted to be competitive and have high reliability, almost every night between the races, which were about every 2 weeks. And as long as we did that and we established a regular maintenance program, then the car was very competitive. As you can see, what's behind us there, various collection of stuff. There's Bob's Dart, and that's some fiberglass thing. I don't remember that. Ace 904. And but the car took a lot of maintenance and a lot of development to make it into a competitive car. We kept the original factory engine up until 1966. That was the one that broke a main cap. It dynoed at 345 horsepower at Shelby. And then during 1966, we collected the parts and built a new engine, which was the one that we, after we built it, we tested it at West Palm, which I guess is now Moroso, and then tore it down and put it back together again with all the same parts and took it to Riverside to run out there where we won the national championship. But this is a, a fairly tight course. It's an airport course with a lot of corners in it. And so these little guys in these very small cars get up on us in the corners, and then as soon as we get her through the corner, why, we get going again. Now that 904 that's behind me actually ran a class above me. It was an A production and we were in B production, and that was a case where I think the 904 was it's an overhead cam 2-liter engine, but a fiberglass body and very lightweight car. But you can see there we're holding our own against him. And let's see, well, I think the primary shortcomings, there weren't many after we got through with it, were the reliability or high maintenance, if you want to put it that way. And that resulted from the fact that a Mustang was not originally designed as a race car, as a Ferrari are, and so forth and so on. It says here, what driver or team gave you the stiffest competition during the 66 B production season? Well, in Corvettes, it was Don Yenko. How's that? See that where we did in that Cobra? Took him on the inside of a corner. Well, here's a quick shot of Mid-Ohio. And the blue car going by, Shelby, is Donahue. There he is. That's Mark. And that was a very ill-fated weekend. That's where I learned about the need for shock absorbers and a few other things. And that was in '66. That was our first trip up north, and really took a beating that weekend. The shocks were bad. The points closed on us, and it just wasn't very beneficial. And then we went over to Pennsylvania, see the dent in the fender. Marty Crinner, that was later killed at a race, was driving a Shelby, and he nailed me in a corner. And then we went on to, this is taken at Daytona. This is where that's what the car was designed for, Daytona. Wow. And that's Peter Gregg's 906 next to me there. I think he and I were on the front row, yeah. And again, of course, he isn't in my class. He's in some higher class. And that car, actually, even though we're right next to each other, is a much faster car. But you see what's behind us, Cobras and Vets and an old Ferrari and XKE and on and on and on. So in this race, and by the way, we weren't a high-dollar team, so what we did was did what we had to do to accumulate the points in order to go to Riverside. And when it was obvious I couldn't stay with Peter, then I stroked it a little bit and ran, ahead of the cars in my own class. And why burn up an engine and get premature wear on the engine when chasing Peter when everybody else is behind me? And they were running, I think, with a Scorpion, which was a rear-engine Chevy-powered modified car. And right about there, we're around 155, 160, and then down the back straight just before we get going into the infield. I think it was at that race we clocked 172 points something. There's an XKE differential between the two cars. That looks about what the grandstand looks like at 24 hours. Hopefully there'll be more people in the infield. Then, not on this lap, but here pretty soon you'll see me come down on an Alpha, which is in a much lower class, but it's an indication of how well we had the brakes working, because we were able to outbrake the Alpha going into that 180 left-hander there. Well, what else do we have here? Well, in stiff competition, of course, Don Yenko was the top Corvette driver in the country, and Mark Donahue was the only other Shelby driver that was really tough. And then in the Tiger, there was only one Tiger. He'd been around for a couple of years, and that was Ron Dykes. And those were well, there's that Jag again. Boy, they just don't go very quick. Actually, those were the three different makes, groups of cars that were the toughest to compete with. And the Lotus Elan was tough, but we just didn't see many of them in '66. Now there's the Alpha, see? And then we get into the corner and get ready to come out of the corner, and then the Alpha is able to pull right up on me until I get it straightened out and get on the gas. We the Lotus Elan actually ran in B production the same as we did, but there just weren't a lot of them around. Now, when we went to Riverside, there was a fellow named Leitzinger from the northeast of the United States that qualified to come out to Riverside, but he elected not to, and Mark was an alternate, and Mark came out in place of him. That's a 427 Vet and a Cobra that I just lapped. Okay, here. Any close calls or mishaps that year on your way to the national title? There's that Jag again. No, not at all. Really, I had Krenner put a dent in the fender in Pennsylvania, but that was about it. The cars are so easy to drive. They're very forgiving. I'd driven a lot of other cars that were much smaller and lower horsepower that were really more difficult to drive. So the key to this car was to get the handling neutral on it and balanced and brakes working and maintain the car so that every part of the chassis and engine and brakes, everything were working to maximum capacity all the time, and then you just got in it and went like you're going to the grocery store. So we really didn't have any close calls to speak of. And next question here, 6, do you have one fondest or clearest memory of that competitive season? Well, I guess there's Peter passing a Cobra, and let's see, I think, and I pulled over to let Peter go by me. Or where's I thought there was somewhere in here I was passing there. Getting that Cobra also, but I don't, maybe a little later. Well, I guess there's several things. One was 172 miles an hour down the back straight at Daytona. That was exciting. That was a real thrill. And of course the next thing was winning the national championship against such drivers as Don Yenko and Mark Donahue. Um, this is where we went out to Riverside, California for the 1966, they call it the Road Race of Champions. And the way you go to the runoffs, there were, let's see, 7 divisions, and the top 3 cars in points from each division then were invited out to Riverside in each class, and we ran in B production. And so I contacted Hertz, and they were kind enough to give us that blue Hertz car that you saw earlier there to drive while we're in California. And what I wanted to do is to drive nothing but a Shelby on the street or on the track all the time that I was in California. But we had to visit farm here, of course, but on the time that we had off. But, yeah, today, of course, Shelby cars are regarded with more than a little reverence. We're wondering just how you felt about your R car back in '66 when the season was finished. Did you ever, even in your wildest dreams, imagine just how fantastically expensive and coveted the cars would become just 2 decades later? Well, of course not. I think we had an opportunity to buy the car for like $3,000 or something, but we were done. Webster and I and my son Chip and Artie and the other people that worked on the crew, we'd achieved our national championship, and really we were done with the car. So we gave it back to Randy Blessing, the owner of the car, and he drove it for a couple of years. Unfortunately, after we parted company with it, it rolled 3 times at Fernandina Beach, and then after it was sold to Don Cummings of Daytona, and Don or whoever was driving at Sebring, there seems to be a little confusion about who was in the car, stuffed it into a sandbank, and that tweaked the front end on it, and so that's why there isn't much left of the original cars. But you know, old race cars in those days, you got rid of them and they went down in value, and they were bent and tweaked, and people had no interest in them. We had no idea that they would rise in value as much as they have. And then after there, we going to Disneyland after we were at the other place there, Knott's Berry Farm. Okay, your next question here, and now here is at Riverside that you see there. How do you feel about vintage racing circa 1990? Does it in any way compare with SCCA competition during the 60s, or is it strictly Walter Mitty type affair? Well, in some of the cars, you get into the super expensive cars and the very old cars, it is kind of a go for show, but in production cars like these, it's the Shelbys and the Camaros and the Boss 302s and the Corvettes and so forth, it's real racing. There's just no doubt about it, and that's what makes it fun, is to build the engines. These engines that we're using in our cars that we build here in Evergreen are absolutely vintage technology and vintage legal. They're 289 engines, bored 30, which is 293 cubic inches. We started out a couple of years ago with around, I have to convert now from road horsepower to engine horsepower, around 350 horsepower, and then in '88 we were at 376 with 3 engines we built, and then in '89 the engine in the coupe, which also was a 293, we were up to 412 horsepower, and still using the tri-Y headers. Now this year we Chip and I think that we will be able to reach pretty close to 425 horsepower, and that's at 6,700 RPM, and still have a legal engine. And the brakes that we used then, the brakes that we use now, are Mustang brakes. They're not the Lincoln brakes that some of the Shelbys are using. However, the coupe that I have does use Lincoln brakes or Thunderbird brakes. They're interchangeable. And that's Jerry Titus going out in that 911. And let's see what else we got here at Riverside. This is practice at Riverside. That's Danny Gerber Baby Foods family, and Don Yenko, and Ron Dykes in the Tiger, and that's Freddie Van Buren in R108 that won the year after I did, and I think Freddie finished 4th behind me. Well, let's see what else you have here. I think that's all the questions. So it's really fun to have the restriction of building the car to vintage technology and making the car highly competitive. And it's a matter of, very carefully building the engine, getting the maximum out of the engine, and then matching the engine power curve to the transmission gears and selecting the right rear end for each track. And then the big tires that we use, and we run an 8.5-inch rim in the back, which is legal, which you'll see on R103 here at Riverside. Helps out considerably. What we try to do is make the car as easy as possible to drive, and that's Freddie there, I think, and so that when we pass the vintage car on to someone that's doesn't have a lot of experience, that they can enjoy the car and get the maximum capability and performance out of the car because it's such an easy car to drive. The area that we're concentrating, we're pretty satisfied with the rear suspension, and we haven't had time to check what we'll be doing here shortly. We do have a complete portable alignment equipment. Chip and I will take the springs off one of the cars and then exercise it up, down, tilt, so forth, and check the toe-in and caster and camber and see if what Shelby came up with originally is really the optimum. If not, we possibly can change it, within the limits of vintage. And after that, the next thing we need to do is to get the front brakes to be more effective. On a race car, you don't have most effective brakes until you reach a point where you can lock up all four brakes, all four wheels anywhere on the track, which is kind of tough on a Shelby because of all that weight on the front. But we have some things that we're planning on looking at this year. Now, that coupe over there on the left was driven by Don Pike, and that belonged to Shelby. Now, I think it belonged to Don, and Shelby was backing it, but it was run as a factory back car in a sedan. Those wheels on the rear are American Mag dished mags, 8.5-inch. They were drag wheels that we came up with, and which those NASCAR or stock car tires worked extremely well. Now, Donahue had researched the fender opening as we had in the rear, and he'd come up with the same dished mag, only he was running an 8-inch wheel, and we ran 8.5. He had exactly the same tires. By the time we got to Riverside, the word was out on the kind of tires we were using, and Mark had the same tires out of the same batch. We could tell that from the numbers on the tires. As I had mentioned, I think we had the weight down to 2406 on the car. That was and there's Donahue in his reverse color. The way that happened, originally, see, that was one of the cars provided by Shelby, and then they kind of backed off on backing Mark, so he got mad at him, and that's what prompted him to reverse the colors on the car. When we went to Riverside, we could get our weight down to 2406. When we weighed the car here in Evergreen with gasoline, it weighed 2925. It really was a lead sled, but that's what the weight was when we went to Watkins Glen, but it went anyway. It performed well regardless, and that's the next step for our R103 is to get the weight back down on it. Now, that corner there, I'm not sure what corner that is, 1, 2, 4. It's we were quite concerned because we had difficulty keeping the rear end on the ground. You see those wheels on Mark's car there, the same as on mine. So we, during that week that we were there, we went out to a salvage yard and got a set of stock Mustang springs, which further softened the rear end. And that allowed me to keep the rear end from coming out. We were quite concerned. There's the back straight, 145 something, pulling it down in the corner with a 427 behind me. we were concerned about Yenko. He was right next to me on the grid, so if I outdrug him getting started, he would be behind me, and I didn't want to get tapped again like in the rear end like I had been the year before at Daytona. We only were able to obtain 145 miles an hour at Riverside, and that just because the track was the run, full throttle run, was shorter than at Daytona, because we had the advantage at Daytona of having the east banking to launch off of to get our top speed up down the back straight. That was the Econoline that the dealer had given me to use, and that was no tow car, I'll tell you, with that short wheelbase and long overhang. It was a tricky thing to drive. You can see the tires, they were tall, but they weren't wide. Now those are 29.2 inch diameter tires, and now the biggest that we can get are 26.7, and they're probably wider than those tires. But nowadays the tires are they're wide, but they aren't real tall. The front tires that we run now are about the same as those. They're 25 point something. So we run the 25.5 inch tire in the front at the present time, and the 29.2 inch tire in the rear. Well, we don't see that much. Do we? Look at that lineup of Vets and Cobras there. Those were the A production cars. The 427 Vets and all the Cobras ran in A production. And then this is the B production cars, and we're lined up there the way that we qualified. I'm on the pole, Don Yanko's next to me, and then Donahue and Ron Dykes were in the second row. No, that's not Shelby. I don't know. I guess at Disneyland, we got those hats. We wanted something kind of unique, and since we had the red on the roof. By the way, the red on the roof was a result of my son, who in 1965, after we first got the car, he was trying to determine which Shelby was the one I was driving. And one way we came up with that was first year we got shelf paper and put on the roof to identify the car before it was close enough to see the numbers. And then in the winter of 65 and early 66, when the dealer repainted the car for us, he actually painted the red on it. Recently we tried to match that red, and you might believe it, well, it came out a Ferrari color. And these are the cars pulling out onto the grid. Now, when we ran in the runoffs for the national championship, we ran A and B productions cars at the same time. But unlike the year before, they started the A production cars first, the idea being that we could run the two groups on the track at the same time. And they were supposed to, there's Mark, and that's a Lotus Elan there, and of course a Vet and so forth. And that's Danny Gerber. That's the last that car will be seen intact. And this is the starting grid. I'm on the pole, and Yanko's right next to me, and Ron Dykes and the Tiger, and Donahue and I think it's R105 was his car, are in the second row, right behind me. And we're off. And they had started the A production cars on ahead of us. Like I say, that's the only Tiger that ever ran worth a hoot. But I was able to keep Ron behind me, but he gnawed on me most of the time. and that other Shelby. Now there's Danny Gerber's car. He got tangled up, I think, with a Land and a Corvette, and ended up in the wall. The car developed a small fire. He got out and tried to go to the front of the car, but I think he broke both his ankles, and he recovered fine, and they stripped the car, and who knows what happened to it. Don't we wish we knew where some of the major pieces were now, to reconstruct that thing. But times were different then. The cars just didn't, nobody would ever believe that they would ever obtain the value that they did. And that's the S's as we begin. Then we come around the corner and get started down the back straight. There's Donahue and Freddie Van Buren behind us. See, I really couldn't hold off the Tiger in the corners, but once I got straightened out, I could out-accelerate him and beat him down the straights, and then he would get on me in the next corner. And there we are, Webster and I going around for our victory lap. You see some of the collection of junk down there, and that's where there they are, some of the wrecks. That's where Ken Miles was killed in the J car right there. Well, John, it's after midnight Thursday night, so that's about the end of this. Ultimately, I'll get you some film or video on R103 in 1989. So we'll see you in Daytona.
Ready to stop and talk.